In the history of racial segregation in America, one troubling chapter is that of sundown towns. These were communities that prohibited Black people and other minorities from being within town limits after sunset. Though most sundown towns have faded into the past, the legacy still lingers. Today, we look at 10 sundown towns that continue to exist and reflect on their history, their present, and what can be done to confront this dark legacy. History of sundown towns. Sundown towns first emerged during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, at the height of racial tension and the practice of segregation. As Black Americans were transitioning from enslavement to freedom after the Civil War, new forms of racial control took shape, particularly in the northern and western states where racism wasn't as overt as in the South. Sundown towns were an explicit, legal means of maintaining racial exclusivity, especially in places where African Americans, Mexican Americans, and Jewish people were increasingly migrating in search of better lives. These policies were enforced through local ordinances, intimidation, and violence. The message was clear: Black people, Jews, Mexican Americans, and other minorities were not welcome after dark. The name Sundown comes from a clear and chilling directive often posted at the town limits, and other minorities were not allowed to be in the town after sunset. Some towns had formal laws prohibiting non-white people from being there overnight, while in others, the threat of violence or the presence of a local white supremacist group like the Ku Klux Klan was enough to ensure compliance. The most common reason for the policies was to keep white neighborhoods pure. But in many towns, Black residents or other minorities were still required to perform manual labor and were not welcomed in other capacities. Many towns used signs to mark their limits, and some towns even physically marked places where Black people were not allowed to enter. The legacy today. While overt racial policies are illegal today, many of these towns still bear the scars of their sundown past. The long-lasting effects of these racial exclusionary practices cannot be erased overnight, and they are often still felt by those who attempt to integrate or move into these areas. Despite the passage of time, a troubling racial homogeneity persists in these towns, with many continuing to be overwhelmingly white. Here are 10 towns that still exist in some form today. While most no longer enforce sundown policies overtly, the legacy of segregation remains alive in their streets, culture, and the unspoken barriers faced by minorities seeking to live, work, or visit these communities. First, Vidor, Texas.
Like pretty much everybody I know in Texas that's Black tells me, do not go to Vidor, Texas. I'm like, okay. Yet here I was in Vidor, Texas.
Vidor is one of the most notorious modern-day examples of a sundown town. Historically a hub for the Ku Klux Klan, the town maintained its all-white status for decades. Despite reports of efforts for change, Vidor is a town that still remains unsafe for Black people today. The town has a reputation for racial hostility, and though no laws are on the books banning Black residents, unwritten rules and social pressures linger. Recently, a trucker found himself in a terrifying situation when he delivered a load to Vidor. Watch as he shares this horrible encounter.
So I get to the place, I'm not giving names of companies or anything like that, but while I'm driving to the place, I see trailer parks, I see a bunch of Confederate flags. I saw a doll of a Black man. It was just a doll wrapped in a Confederate flag hanging from a tree by its neck. That's the type of stuff I saw in Vidor, Texas, which led me to believe that the reputation was fairly earned. I get there, the security guard says, hey, we got a code red. The guy gets on the phone, is like, hey, I can't, I don't want to be responsible for this guy's safety. Let me go ahead and find somebody because we stopped taking loads at 4 o'clock. But I'll get somebody over here from the other side of the plant. Tell them to hang on. So I hang on. I'm doing what I got to do. Finally, somebody comes by about 15 minutes later. The guy said, let me hurry up and get you unloaded. He quickly gets me unloaded. And they said, dude, you might want to get up out of here as soon as possible. We're at sundown. You want to leave here now. Don't stop until you at least get to Beaumont. I was like, okay. He was like, no, seriously. I said, well, what about the police? Why aren't the police there? Police turned a blind eye. I was like, okay, well, I'm gonna do what you said. He said, yeah, man, I don't want to see you getting in any trouble.
Vidor, Texas, is perhaps one of the most well-known sundown towns, with a history of white supremacy and racial violence. African Americans were actively discouraged from living in Vidor, and the town earned a reputation for hostility toward any black person who dared to settle there. Even today, there are reports of subtle racial tensions lingering beneath the surface. The town has made efforts toward integration in recent decades, but its history of exclusion remains a powerful force in shaping its modern-day culture. The town was closely associated with the Ku Klux Klan, especially in the early 20th century, when the Klan promoted racial segregation and violence. Racial exclusion continued well into the 1980s and 1990s, with local residents openly refusing to sell homes to black families. This history of racism and discrimination is a painful part of Vidor's legacy. 2. Marion, Indiana. In Marion, Indiana, a dark chapter of racial violence unfolded in 1930 when two black men, Thomas Shipp and Abram Smith, were lynched by a mob. Their bodies hung from a tree in the center of town. Marion, once infamous for its sundown town practices, still carries the weight of that brutal history. The city had a reputation for racial exclusion, which lasted well into the mid-20th century. Today, Marion's population is more diverse than it was during the height of segregation. Yet racial tensions and the legacy of that horrific event are still palpable. African Americans in Marion have historically faced challenges, from limited housing options to being treated as second-class citizens in everyday interactions. In the last several decades, efforts have been made by some residents to acknowledge the town's racist past, with small victories toward integration. But, for many, the town's history still looms large, shaping their perception of Marion as a place where black people may never truly feel at home. 3. Sullivan, Indiana. Sullivan, Indiana, also had a sundown town policy that was enforced through violence and threats. The town's policies were formalized with local ordinances barring black residents from staying overnight, and these ordinances were not repealed until the civil rights movement of the 1960s. In fact, Sullivan's exclusionary practices were so entrenched that African Americans traveling through the town in the 1920s and 1930s were often harassed or forced to turn back. 4. Belton, Texas. Belton, Texas, has long been associated with its past as a sundown town. Though the population is more diverse today, some African Americans still report feeling uneasy in the town after dark. During the height of segregation, African Americans who attempted to live or stay in Belton after sunset were met with violence or threats of violence. The town is part of a larger region in central Texas that has a history of excluding black people from residential areas and certain public spaces. 5. Cynthiana, Kentucky. In the early 20th century, Cynthiana, Kentucky, had a reputation for making sure African Americans knew they weren't welcome after dusk. Signs were posted at the town's borders warning black people to leave before sundown, a message that was often reinforced through physical violence. Though Cynthiana's official sundown policies have long been abolished, the town remains largely white today. African Americans who have attempted to move to Cynthiana in recent years still encounter challenges. Many speak of subtle but deeply rooted racial tensions that have yet to be addressed, leaving them to feel like outsiders in a town that, despite appearances, has not fully shed its history. 6th, Forsyth County, Georgia. In Forsyth County, Georgia, the policy of racial exclusion was enforced well into the 20th century, particularly after the 1912 expulsion of black residents. The black population of Forsyth was driven out by violence and intimidation, leaving the county completely white for decades. Despite the population's diversity today, the historical roots of segregation and the lingering legacy of Forsyth as a sundown area are still felt. 7. Harrison, Arkansas. Harrison, Arkansas was known for its deep ties to the Ku Klux Klan and its reputation as a sundown town. The Klan's influence in the town reached its peak in the 1920s, and for decades, African Americans and other minority groups were barred from living in or visiting Harrison. Although the town has made efforts to promote inclusivity, its history remains a source of tension, especially for people of color visiting or moving to the area. Harrison is now home to an annual civil rights march aimed at confronting the town's past. But despite these efforts, many still view Harrison as a town where racism is just beneath the surface. The presence of Confederate flags, occasional hate speech, and the town's overwhelmingly white population continue to signal that the town's history has not been fully addressed. 8. Anna, Illinois. In Anna, Illinois, the town's exclusion of black people continued well into the 1960s. Local ordinances prohibited African Americans from living in the town, and signs that read, "Don't let the sun set on you here," were a constant reminder of the town's unwelcome stance. Though the town has since changed, the shadows of this past still remain. Though Anna today is far more integrated than it was during its Sundown era, the town's racial composition remains predominantly white. While few overt acts of racial hostility are reported today, the town's history still influences the experiences of people of color who choose to move to Anna, and many still speak of feeling like outsiders. 9. Westfield, Indiana. Westfield, Indiana, was a town that prohibited African Americans from living or staying overnight for much of the 20th century. While it is more integrated now, some longtime residents still recall the legacy of exclusion, and the town's racial makeup remains largely white. The town's history is frequently discussed in local discourse, and though progress has been made, some residents continue to feel the ripple effects of Westfield's segregationist past. 10th. Minden, Louisiana. Minden, Louisiana, had a long history as a sundown town, particularly in the early 1900s. Though the population is more diverse now, the town still carries the weight of its racially discriminatory past. Many African Americans choose not to visit or settle there due to the town's lingering legacy of exclusion, and there are reports of continued racism in both subtle and overt forms. Confronting the legacy, the towns we've mentioned are not anomalies. They are part of a larger national issue of racial exclusion that spanned decades. While many of these towns are making efforts to confront their histories, the legacy of sundown towns is not easily erased. As America continues to wrestle with its past, it is essential to recognize and confront the deep-seated racism that continues to shape the country today. Acknowledging the existence of sundown towns and the long-lasting impacts of their policies is the first step toward healing and reconciliation. The question now is, how do we move forward together? This has been a glimpse into the towns that still carry the legacy of segregation. The journey for equality continues, and it begins with understanding the past.